dangerous cuts across the board. Defense cuts that I believe would do real damage to our security, our troops and their families, and our military's ability to protect the nation.
Well, this is a really important topic, and joining me now to talk more about this is Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow with the Center for American Progress. Dr. Korb, thanks for being here. You served as Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. You know a great deal about this. I want to get your take on what we heard today from Secretary of Defense Panetta.
Well, Secretary of Defense Panetta is trying to basically keep the spirits up of the organization he took over. But as former director of OMB, he knows that the defense budget now, even if you control for inflation, is higher than at any time since the end of World War II. It is higher than it was at the height of the Reagan buildup. So yes, we can afford to cut it. But and then, of course, he's playing the family card. Well, we got to take care of our military family. Nobody's talking about doing anything like that. Those of us who worked, you know, with the Bowles-Simpson Deficit Reduction Commission and all the various other groups that have looked at that show how you can do it without really hurting military families.
I know that President Obama has said before that he's not opposed to cutting military spending. You know, that this is some place that could be looked at. And we did hear from him back in April during a speech on fiscal policy. Let's listen to a little bit of what he had to say.
So just as we must find more savings in domestic programs, we must do the same in defense. And we can do that while still keeping ourselves safe. Over the last 2 years, Secretary Bob Gates has courageously taken on wasteful spending, saving $400 billion in current and future spending. I believe we can do that again.
I believe we can do that again. This was back in April. Have you seen anything that shows that we are going in that direction at this point?
Well, first of all, Secretary Gates didn't save $400 billion. He pretended to save it by, you know, announcing that weapons that were already going to be canceled, he was going to cancel. They weren't even in the program. He found $178 billion in efficiencies, but he plowed $100 billion back into other new programs. What President Obama said back in April is very similar to what they agreed as the first part of the deficit deal, that security spending would be cut by $350 billion over the next decade. Security spending also includes veterans, it includes State Department, it includes the Department of Homeland Security. So it's very similar to what he said back then. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that when they talked about cuts, up until now, they've talked about reducing the projected level of increases, not cutting. When you and I talk about cutting, it means we're going to get less salary than we got last week. No, in the Defense Department, it means we won't get as much as we thought, but we're still going to get more.
I think that it's risen every single year for at least the last 13 years.
13 years. It's gone up in real terms.
Wow.
You know, when I worked for President Reagan, it went up 4 years, but then we had the big deficit, so we cut it the next 4 years. So you can do that, and this idea that somehow you're going to have all these apocalyptic scenarios, it normally happens when people say that, but we've done it before, and you know what? Gee, we won the Cold War. You know what? When Richard Nixon left office, you can't call him soft on defense, we were spending in today's dollars $350 billion. $200 billion less than we're spending now. What you need is good management, and Panetta ought to, you know, get some people who can keep weapons systems growth under control and not buy weapons we don't need.
Well, speaking of weapons we don't need, I want to take a look at some specific programs our defense budget spends money on. Some of the most expensive aircrafts in the world. I'm talking, here's one example, the F-22. 187 were purchased at a cost of $77.4 billion. There's also the F-35. The government purchased nearly 2,500 of those with a cost of $1 trillion. Now, something unique, the reason that I point these two aircrafts out is because both of them, I know the F-22 has been grounded for a while. I think yesterday the F-35 has been grounded. So these are aircrafts that are not being used. Some of the most expensive. Talk about that as it relates to wasteful spending.
Well, what happened is, after the events of September 11th, the Defense Department didn't have to make any hard choices, and they did not pay attention to the weapons programs that they had. Their own business board, the Defense Department has one appointed by the Secretary of Defense, said you had $400 billion in cost overruns. You spent $50 billion on weapons that you've already canceled. So, no, they haven't been managing the department. And you know, it's interesting, if you go back and look at our history, when Richard Nixon came in, he appointed a Deputy Secretary of Defense, and that's the key position. David Packard from Hewlett-Packard. And you know, he was able to cut the budget and get the weapon systems done and get them done on time. Oh. And you know who was a great Secretary of Defense? One vice president may not have been the same, Dick Cheney, because he brought in Don Atwood from General Motors, and they got spending under control.
You know, a lot of companies that the U.S. pays, you know, big bucks to manufacture these weapons. These are not competitive in the global market. These are not weapons that we're selling to other countries or even equipment that we're selling to other countries. Why is it that the U.S. makes so many things that we're not able to then make money off of?
Well, we do sell them, and I think it's important to keep in mind we're the world's largest arms exporter. I mean, we sell an awful lot of weapons around the world, and the Defense Department likes to do that because that reduces the unit cost of the weapons that we buy. For example, the F-35, or the Joint Strike Fighter, is going to be bought supposedly by about 14, you know, other countries. We sell the F-15 around the world, the F-16. That's really not the issue. The issue is, do we get the weapon systems under control so the American taxpayer doesn't have to pay more for them?
We are out of time, but just a little note. Bloomberg did some number crunching, and they found that the spending on missile defense over the last 27 years, including the next year, is $150 billion. That's the same as the Apollo space program. Kind of interesting when you put it all in perspective. Dr. Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow with the Center for American Progress.